Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I would like to welcome Professor Alessio Fasano. I'm honored to share many precious and important things with him concerning microbiome, and we'll see the difference between these two. And especially its interactions, which are almost disrupting and multiple in this very complex thing that we call the human organism. In one of my master classes, I call the Microbiota-Gut-Brain-Mind axis because, as you know, usually people talk about the microbiota gut-brain axis, but as a psychologist I prefer to add the mind to it, because as we know from science, the two things are closely linked but partly separate. I always mention an extreme example, which is very clear, of a very ordinary person living an ordinary life who receives a phone call where they say that his loved one has been involved in an accident. This interaction that is purely an exchange of information, it is not made up of physics or chemistry, but it is an information that enters the mind with a dramatic and fast consequence at a physiological, cellular level. Just think about the central peripheral nervous system activity. So I put it in this axis. But I would also like to talk about the book you wrote, Human Microbiome, tipping the scales between health and pathology, which is also the title of our meeting today, because we need to inform people about the interaction of microbiota, because all healthcare professions have yet to fully understand the nature of these interactions. That's why I consider your book one of the best books on the topic, also because it has an integrated vision. We were saying earlier off air, conceptually I see you as a pupil of the Salerno School, with the limits of the time of the Salerno School. They had already made huge innovation and steps ahead to see this integrated approach in healing people. I find this dimension also in your wonderful book. And my first question would be, why have you put a subtitle, Tipping the Scales Between Health and Pathology? First of all, Massimo, thank you for inviting me again. It's always a great joy for me to talk to you because it is very stimulating. We have complementary experiences and a similar vision. I believe that the discovery of this parallel world that is quite recent, because in the recent past we thought that all microorganisms were pathogenic and detrimental. Now it is very clear that most of them are symbiotic, and it's in their interest to create a friendly relationship with us. Now that we have learned this type of concept, we realize that if we don't take care of our microbiome, from a strength it becomes a problem. It will cause problems. So if we don't take good care of our microbiome with a lifestyle consistent with the evolutionary plans of the human being, the consequences we would pay is that we tip the scales towards pathology. On the contrary, if we take care of the microbiome, hence the brain or the mind, whether we talk about neurological or behavioral problems, we pay consequences. The difference is that the microbiome has the ability, and later we can talk more about it, to fully influence the biological functions which are the summation which allow you to be healthy or create conditions in which this health state, this steady state, is lost. Yes, because Alessio, as we were saying earlier, off air, there is this interaction, a multiple interaction. That is, the microbiome is very sensitive to many factors, which for the microbiome represent its environment, ranging from physical, chemical factors, the more trivial factors to understand, to things that are less trivial, less simple. Like, for example, we know that psychosocial stress influences this state, this huge ecosystem that we call microbiota. So the microbiota is the target of many changes which represent our lifestyle as well. For example, physical activity, nutrition, sleep quality, all these elements impact the composition of the microbiota, which in turn affects, and here comes my need to explain a little bit what epigenetics is, because if we don't understand epigenetics, we don't understand the interaction between these microorganisms and the cells with the human DNA. But this interaction is also an epigenetical interaction, which determines many things of our well-being and life quality. With Professor Fasano, indeed, we are planning to write a book which includes this concept of funnel effect or bottleneck effect of all these factors on the microbiota. Why have we called it bottleneck or funnel effect? Because these factors, at least partly, are independent, but they converge in their impact on the composition of the microbiota. So, in short, if, for example, I perfectly eat, I have my Mediterranean diet, and I mean the original Mediterranean diet, not the more modern, the revisited one. Maybe also with the right lifestyle, doing physical activity, for example. However, I have the bad habit of sleeping 2 hours less than my optimum sleeping regime, then I impact the microbiota in a negative sense. Then we know that there are many interactions sleeping, for example, 2 hours less than my average affects many things. There are hormonal implications on the circadian rhythm, but there is a huge influence on the microbiota, which will respond with its interaction with human cells in the way that we are beginning to understand. This concept has been establishing of adaptome, a combination between the human genome and the genome of the non-human ecosystem. This is important to understand because our fitness depends on this harmonious collaboration. You talk about this genetic collaboration very often. You talk about matching these interactions, and I find this very interesting. Because, for example, at a psychological level alone, we have evidence which shows us if an organism, and this has already been proven in mice, but if these mice have a dysbiosis, they will not learn not to feel fear. That is, if that mouse has its microbiota imbalance, eubiosis, that mouse, by learning, will no longer be scared by that stimulus. But in a dysbiosis state, it will never learn not to feel fear. An interesting thing that has already been proven experimentally is that if we bring back the gut to a eubiosis state, the mouse will learn not to be afraid anymore of the stimulus. This shows us a huge complexity, and I find it extremely awesome. Massimo, you touched upon several points that, in my opinion, are a breakthrough in the world of the microbiome, which is at a crossroads to capitalize on this research for clinical applications. You were talking about funnel. There is a necessary way to go in order for the interaction with the microbiome to express itself in a clinical outcome. And I think that there is more and more evidence to try to understand why we human beings who have been engineered by evolution in such a sophisticated way, we still need to have an interaction with the microbiome to be fit, and to understand why, if the microbiome is damaged, it results in pathology for us. So you touched upon a few factors: stress, nutrition, sleeping hygiene, as well as pollution, how you were born, if it was a C-section, what you ate in your early life, the microbiotics you took. All these elements lead to the change of the composition of the microbiota, which can have clinical repercussions. This is not random. This is a huge advantage for us. If you don't consider the world as focused on humanity as at the center of the world, but we are a small part of a broader picture, and you try to find fixed rules of the game which apply to plants, to smaller animals, to bigger animals, there are two rules which are in common. One is that the main purpose is the preservation of the species, that is, preserving the species from one generation to the next. And the second is that in order to survive, you need to learn to adapt, because if you don't adapt, you lose and you become extinct. If you adapt, you win and you survive. How many animals did become extinct because they didn't adapt fast enough to adjust to the existing reality? This is again to say that it is important to learn to adapt soon in order to survive. Humans biologically have a very poor adaptation capacity with a long life cycle, the average age of 70-80 years, as well as a gestational age of 9 months, and genetic mutations that are required to adapt. You change a gene that can be detrimental and is eliminated because it's detrimental. But if you change a gene, that is beneficial, you keep it, but it takes generations. But adaptation requires faster changes, and Mother Nature came up with a great idea, the symbiosis with the microbiota, which changes quickly because it's a sort of funnel, and as you said, epigenetically it can determine if, how, when and why our genes are triggered or not. If I may use a parallel, consider the human genome as a piano with 32,000 keys. Someone needs to play it, and the notes which come out, their tunes, the harmonies that are played depend on which keys you touch, and this is what the microbiome does. It touches some keys, others not. So it up regulates some genes and down regulates other genes, resulting in a phenotype which adapts in a shorter time than genetical mutations, and allows us to adapt to the situation. A classic example is I see or I learn a very stressful information that changes my microbiome, and if my microbiome is in symbiosis, it gives me a survival response that is the right one. So it changes my arterial pressure, it changes the level of other hormones, and it allows me to manage the stressful situation so that everything works how Mother Nature had established. If, on the other hand, and you made the example of the mouse, you have dysbiosis, the response is inappropriate. How many times do we ask why do people have problems of depression and anxiety? Why do these situations continue? Correct me if I'm wrong. You're the master here. When stimulated, when triggered, anxiety and depression are physiologically important. The problem is that they continue over time also because of inappropriate triggers, and this goes to our detriment. So if it's true, and it's true that there is this communication between the gut, the brain, the microbiome, and the mind, the fact that the microbiome is a funnel, if my microbiome is not attuned, the response becomes pathological, and my anxiety problem stays with me 24 hours a day. I think that the great role of the microbiome in regulating our genome and adapting in short time allows us to understand why we want to be attuned with our microbiome, why Mother Nature has created this interaction, and the damage that we are suffering on a daily basis in our Western life make us pay the consequences since we don't take care of our microbiome. Yes, this goes back to the scales, the tip in the scales between health and pathology. What you said triggers a lot of thinking in me, and also a lot of change from what I've learned at school. If I think about my PhD thesis, the title of which is the adaptive meaning of a psychological mechanism that is called optimal experience. But in those years, I thought that the adaptive meaning should have been only looked for inside the human genes, because that's what I had been taught. That was my reference paradigm. But here we need to take a leap forward, which has already been scientifically determined, because actually the fitness of an organism is not focused on the genes and only the human genes, but on their interaction with another heritage which is not human. So this marriage sort of determines the fitness of an organism, and this has incredibly impactful clinical outcomes in the work of a psychologist, because the vision is completely different. There is no monolithic organism with these keys that you were describing as the keys of the piano, but there's the piano. There are factors like the microbiome playing the music, and we need to be responsible also for treating well these piano players, because the piano players are our cells as well as these microorganisms. And this shifts the paradigm. Who would have said until not just a few years ago, but today, it is a sort of a provocation to tell a psychologist, do you ask your patient suffering anxiety what is his gut state? The answer usually is, why should I? In most cases. Why there is a very strong scientific evidence in favor. Of course, it takes a few years to incorporate this, to move the information from an academic level to a clinical level. It will take a few years, but we already have the evidence and we should use it. The same as for a physician who's dealing with gut disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, without wondering how that patient manages the psychosocial stress, is an ethical problem, in my opinion, because otherwise we all risk as professionals to fail clinically. And this is also proven by science. the effectiveness of the anxiety management techniques is a little bit above 50%. There must be a reason for this. But we are living in an era where the knowledge we have is already telling us that probably this limit, slightly above 50%, can be improved somehow. There is still very much to do, of course. But we have the right direction to take, and probiota is the way to go. You were talking about the Salerno Medical School, that is very close to me since I am from Salerno. But 2000 years ago, the father of all physicians used to say that all diseases start from the gut. Of course, at the time there was no knowledge of the microbiota or the knowledge that we have now, but there was the intuition. If you read the textbook of the Salerno Medical School, which combines three philosophies, the Arabic one, the Greek from Hippocrates, and the Latin one, which mixes science, astronomy, religion, common sense, etc. You clearly read the same type of principle. At the time, what was a bit naive was that there are 4 elements which manage our clinical destiny, which are earth, water, fire, and air. And these elements are elements of the environment which affect the microbiota. And the health state was considered the balance of these 4 elements which kept you at the center of these dynamics. And an imbalance would cause disease. If I had an inflammatory disease, I was tipped towards the fire section, and I used the water section to go back to the center. This was the vision 2000 years ago, but the principle, the pillars of tipping the scales between health and pathology are all there. If you maybe replace the 4 elements with something more complex, which takes you as a funnel to the composition of the microbiome, which manages how you play your genetic cards. If to go back to what you were saying earlier, it is crazy that a psychologist today doesn't ask this question knowing what we already know. It is equally crazy that a gut doctor doesn't ask a question about, and a gastroenterologist doesn't ask questions about the health state of the patient. One of the diseases we deal with in medicine is the IBS. It's not like I make a biopsy of the gut and I find it inflamed. It's a condition that makes me feel sick because the gut, in all its complexity, for example, peristalsis, the advancement of the content up, down, and the processes of management and absorption, doesn't work in tune. And now we have understood a lot of the impact of the fitness of the behavior on the irritable bowel syndrome, which goes back to the disorders of the brain-gut axis. And in order to treat the IBS, we no longer use the medicine acting on the gut, while focusing on meditation, acupuncture. These are treatments which focus on the behavioral system, which manages through the vague, through the neurotransmitters, through the hormones, the gut functions which are inappropriately modulated and lead to IBS. As you can see, all this is before our eyes, before our nose, and we cannot find the solution because we don't connect the dot. Because if I compartmentalize my treatment as gastroenterologist and I use a drug against gas, I don't search the root of the problem. Whereas the psychologist treating anxiety without seeing the gut somatization that creates the problem, and which could be directive starting from the gut, which leads to anxiety, which creates a vicious circle. I will never get out of this circle. Yes, this is the clinical. There's a very brilliant colleague I'm in touch with. We've also recorded videos together. I'm talking about Professor Maria Rescino. I know her very well. And for the first time worldwide, she proved in October 2021. I remember this because I was really impressed by this paper published on Science. For the first time, she proved the nature. Okay, we have to be careful of how we speak of some specific states of anxiety and depression. And I'm saying some because this doesn't mean that all anxiety and depression states have this cause, but some of them are born as a collateral effect of a defense mechanism against the inflammation set up by the brain to protect from a gut neuroinflammation, which activates a sort of wall, isolates the brain, and the effect of this temporary insulation is the appearance of anxiety and depression states. And this tells us as how we already are in a different world. We cannot look at anxiety only as a psychological factor, because if the patient, for example, is a person, as you say, now I have a patient who has been suffering for 32 years of ulcerous gastric ulcer. If a person like this tells me I'm anxious, I suffer from anxiety states, we need to understand where they come from. Another thing is if a person tells me I had a car accident, since then I cannot drive the car because just looking at the car makes me anxious. But this is a different situation whereby many people tell you I have anxiety, but I don't have a clear reason for that in my mind. And if you dig deeper, you realize that they suffer from systemic inflammations. So this trigger is more than likely. This has already been proven thanks to the work of Professor Rescino. Here comes the beautiful and complicated challenge that we need to deal with. We need to enter a world that clashes with our training. There's one more thing to say, Massimo. This is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, the operators and the professionals need to have a mental opening, understand what is on the way, which is a tsunami of scientific information. And there's also the component of the AI. And we also keep reading online fake news saying that if you change your microbiota, you will solve all your problems. And there are people who exploit and take advantage of all these opportunities, which can be ill managed. For example, how many people are taking probiotics now because very good for your health, because they make your skin smoother or they make you live longer? This because they read it online. If we are able to do something like that, because the aging processes are very interesting, as well as the learning processes are equally interesting. If tomorrow we could improve our IQ just by taking a specific probiota, I don't exclude it from potential futures, but this is not where we are right now. It's not that if we make a certain choice to change our microbiome, we capitalize on the concept of mitigating anxiety processes now. I think that you can agree that we are not yet there, but that is the way to go. But as usual, in similar situations, people try to take economic and professional profit from it by saying things, claiming things that are not truthful right now, but maybe will be in the next future. I fully agree with what you said. That's why I like the idea of the funnel effect of the microbiome. That is, the idea of fixing anxiety. And I hear every day people saying, well, if you're saying that if you take the right probiotics, you will no longer be anxious. No, that's not true, because we're not so simple. Then clearly these people go to the chemist and find the chemist offering willingly and superficially the probiotic. Yes, but the risk is if you have that expectation and it doesn't work, you end up saying, that is foolish. You talk about the paper of Maria that is paramount, a milestone. But there's a lot we could capitalize on. However, we should do it in the right way, not looking for shortcuts, giving up to the pressures of those who are trying to just profit from that. I feel this way very strongly, especially on the web. They say you fix everything with probiotics. That's why, and going back to what you were saying about Hippocrates, saying that all diseases are born from the gut. In my opinion, we should make a minor replacement, a minor change. That is, all diseases go through the gut, because the gut is that crossroads with all the elements that we know, the composition, the microbiota, the permeability, all this complexity. Today, maybe for the first time, we can find a common logic to everything, thanks to the work made over the years by thousands of people, over centuries even. However, the gut, in my opinion, is exactly where all diseases cross, because the trigger can be somewhere else as well. My personal experience is that years ago I was seeing these families which had gotten calls from the police saying, your wife died in a car accident, your son died. That trigger does not come from the gut. However, you can be sure that it goes through a gut problem. For example, the chronicity of a disease. Yes, Massimo, you're saying things that are essential, because we are a very complex organism. Without going to extremes, I will give you a very trivial and frequent example. If I am stressed, and stress is physiological, then if the bar is too low, you feel stress even when it's not necessary. But if you have a stress trigger, it is proven that through the vagal nerve, I change the gut motility. It is very easy to have diarrhea if you are stressed. But in case of peristalsis, what happens to the microbiome? There's a quick change to the composition. If we said that the microbiome is the funnel tipping the scales between health and pathology, I'm showing in a very obvious way of what you were saying. It's not like I'm starting from the gut. It's like a circle. Where does it start and where does it end? It's hard to give meaning and to give an end or at the beginning. These are very integrated systems that affect each other. So something that starts from the brain, a stress trigger, changes my microbiome, changes what I do epigenetically. And on the other hand, a gut change of dysbiosis, because I've had an infection or there's an inflammatory process, etc., can translate into a neuroinflammation which changes my behavior, or a number of things like brain aging. In my opinion, this is the most objective way to establish the integration of systems that require each other. It's not one starting and the other one following. Yeah, it's a continuum. It's interesting that the trigger can also be partly of an aspect or the other. What do I mean? Informational, psychosocial, physical, chemical, a parasite. But the dynamics is constant and goes both ways. I'll tell you more. I think that there is quite robust evidence that all five senses can influence the composition and the function of the microbiome. If I see something, if I smell something, if I hear something, if I touch something, all this can have a repercussion on the composition and the function of the microbiome. And it's reasonable because these senses react to my environment, my surroundings, and if it's true that my Mother Nature has created this relationship with the microbiota, I need to have sensors to understand what is going on. Where do they start from? From integrated brain circuits, which are integrated also emotionally. So this is the first time I conceptualize this topic, the five senses impacting the microbiota. It's really beautiful. I understand that it has very interesting implications intuitively. And it also links to what I wanted to tell you a few minutes ago, and I'm telling you now. And it's enlightening for me. That is connected to the fact that we, as people, have a certain type of a conscious perception, that is, the environment is the environment outside our body. If you ask a person what is the more extensive surface you have to the external environment, the answer is the skin, 2 square meters. But the reality is that indeed we do have these 2 square meters, but we have 400 square meters inside our gut, and that is the gateway separating the cellular world or the human DNA from the outside world. But we have it inside our gut. For me, it helps me to understand that that is the greatest exchange with the environment, what we consider the environment. The environment for a person, usually people say it's where you live, your home. But as a provocation, my training courses, I say there's an external social environment outside our organism, interaction with our peers, with our pets. But there's a social environment also inside of us that is equally important, because as you were saying at the beginning of our talk, all the factors, all the social factors of interaction with the microbiota, we know that living with other animals changes the heterogeneity of bacteria that we have. One thing is living in a sterile environment, a sterile setting, and another thing is living in a farm. This is an important concept that will be revisited in the June conference in Rome on human microbiome, that has as a title, One Health. Another topic that we don't understand is that where our genes do not circulate, our microbiome is extremely dynamic. Once a microbiome colonizes your gut, it doesn't remain there for the rest of your life. It's dynamic, and it's influenced by external factors, as you were saying. It has a specific composition and function, but it is a life cycle, because when I eliminate my microbiome with feces, it goes into the earth, and Maybe it fertilizes a plant that the animal eats that I eat, not to speak about vegetables and fruits, etc. So if I focus on the well-being of microbiome without taking care of the environment, my life won't be that easy, because I will have a sick microbiome, so to speak, because it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't fulfill its tasks that Mother Nature had established. We hadn't expected a number of things that we're dealing with now, actually. So taking care of the environment, not only in terms of pollution, etc., but also the great change. I don't want to be politically unfair, but look politically incorrect, sorry, but consider the great change that we are dealing with, that I would have never expected to experience. For example, we should have learned from history. I thought there will never be a war at our gates, but we have 2 or 3 of them on our gates. And don't you think that this has an implication on the psychomental state of people, on their behaviors, with a repercussion on the environment and on what happens to the microbiome? Of course. Not to talk about the stress level and so on and so forth that these people are experiencing. So who knows what type of long-term repercussions there will be. So all this to say that if I came from Mars and I saw everything from the sky, I would ask myself, are they crazy or what? This concept of not taking care of yourself and self-destruct, not just physically with bombs and drones, but for the total abandonment, neglect of the environment, one should ask. So those 2 principles that I had mentioned at the beginning, which are instinctual, so the preservation of the species and the adaptation for survival, we have fully lost them because the common sense would say that these behaviors go against preservation of the species. I'm not making any sort of political or social statement here, but it's paradoxical that if I had as a conscience the fact that I have a biological clock that gives me a beginning and an end, so I'm not infinite, the corollary is that I want to live my life in the healthiest and most harmonious way as possible. So this concept, the paradigm of the war, or maybe in the office quarreling and having fights, shouldn't be there. I know I'm making a utopistic talk, but all this clashes with the principle that says if I know that the microbiota is everything that balances my life, then I take out the probiotic. But why don't we look at the broader picture? That is, if I live well because the people surrounding me and the animals surrounding me will live well. If I don't allow others to live well, I pay the consequences, even if I take as many probiotics as you wish. I hope that the next generations will understand this principle if we don't become extinct as a species. This topic that you're introducing opens up a completely different world apart. As a psychologist, I would like to add that I see this as a challenge that we're dealing with as a human species. Because if there is no growth of our awareness on this global vision by which we also need to be responsible for the environment surrounding us, and inside of us. If we don't take this responsibility as well, the consequences are, even if I'm being optimistic, are quite dramatic. Maybe there's the simile of the dystopian vision where the human species ends up being a parasite, limitless, creating situations of self-destruction. Could also be a future scenario. I wish that at least a part of the people will sort of spread a culture that grows this awareness. I'm an optimist because I think that the new generations have this culture. Unfortunately, the generations managing the human fate right now do not appreciate this. So I trust the next generation. Me too, because I have a son. So psychologically, maybe it's more convenient for me to be optimistic. But as you say, it's not enough to think about it. You need to be proactive. This is also well-being and fitness. Not only psychological well-being. When I talk to my clients, patients, I tell them to be well, you need to effectively manage stress. So you need to be able to manage situations where very often in our society there's no risk of being eaten by a lion, but we live at social toxicity with unbelievable levels of aggression. Just as an aside, I would like to tell you an anecdote. A few years ago, I was at the grocery store. I was in line at the till, since there were many people, and they opened another till, and people ran like a stampede there. There wasn't even the possibility to look if there was someone else coming over. But there's a rate of disrespectfulness that makes us live in feeling ill. If we cannot manage these aggressive actions, they become toxic, and we know this from science as well. The worst way is to leave them passively. To go back to the microbiome, everything that we said can be summarized in the following concept. If it's true, and it seems to be true, that the microbiome is a funnel, if it's true that if the microbiome is well cared for, it keeps me fit, and it is also subject to the environmental change from the world around us and our relationships. The corollary of all this is, let's take care of ourselves and the world around us, and we will take care of our microbiome. And the consequence of this model is that clinically, but not only clinically, but also for citizens, there are interesting consequences. One of the consequences of the funnel effect is that I, as a citizen or as a professional trying to support people struggling, is that we shouldn't just try to optimize one of these factors, but we should have a global vision. That's why off air I was talking about a chain, because our well-being is this chain made up of many elements which affect the microbiome. If I focus on optimizing one or two of these links of the chain, I might run the risk of not seeing that another link of the chain is breaking. That is the problem. Earlier we were talking about this example of Ivan Francescato, a rugby champion who died prematurely at 31. Of course, he did a lot of physical activity. He had the best nutrition, so he had two links of this chain in titanium, but unfortunately he had a link of paper of glass, and this led him to this death. On the other hand, the famous Jean Calmel, a lady who lived 124 years despite smoking for half a century, and I'm not saying that smoking is good for your health, we can assume that no link of her chain was in titanium, but no link was in glass, and this led to a longevity that is converging with this funnel model of the microbiome. And this should be looked into. That's why we are writing a book on this topic. I won't take up too much of your time, Alessio. Thank you for your time. I would spend 25 more hours with you, but knowing the dynamics of the microbiome, this would disrupt my circadian rhythms, my movement and sleeping habits. So thank you for this talk. I hope I see you soon in Italy, hopefully Padua, if not Rome. So thank you very much. Thank you, Massimo. A hug. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, Alessio. Bye. Bye.